But yeah, welcome to Shadow Word Podcast, episode 2. It's been a couple weeks since we did the first one. A lot of people were asking for it back. We have a new guest on today, so I'll go ahead and start off introducing our guest. We'll toss it over to the new guy, Ryeshot. So please introduce yourself, tell everyone who you are and what we're going to do today.
Hey, I'm Ryeshot, aka Shot. I've been playing Shadow since Legion at a mythic level, about world rank 200. You'll probably know me from like being Kyrian in Castle at Athria, but you'll probably best know me for my shot takes on the Warcraft Priest Discord, as well as the Priest beta forums, of which the most recent and most popular one has been Priests Deserve Better. And that's basically my whole stance on the matter, and hopefully we'll be able to discuss more about that.
Sweet. All right, let's go to Saeldur next.
Hello, I am Saeldur. I do a bunch of nerdy things for this class and a lot of theory crafting mainly.
Good deal. And then last but not least, we have Jereico.
Hey guys, thanks for having me on again. Jereico, Shadow Priest main on live, Dragon Extraordinaire on Dragonflight Beta. Having a good time. Thanks for having me, Pub.
Sweet. All right. Well, we have a bunch of really fun topics. I think before we really get into the nitty gritty of topics, a bit has changed since we last did the first podcast. So obviously, pre-patch is now launched. So a lot of you guys, if you haven't had beta or didn't log into PTR, this is, everyone's been able to try out the spec for the first time, which I think has been overall interesting, I think, is what I'll say, to see everyone interact with the spec that we've been giving feedback on for the last 6 months or however long it's been. So just to start off, let's just go around the same way. So we'll go with Shot first. Just kind of talk about, how you've felt about pre-patch launching so far, and how has it been playing Shadow. I think you said you haven't rated on it quite yet, but obviously you've played beta and things like that. So yeah, let's just kind of go around and see how has pre-patch launch been, how are the changes, and what do you think about it?
Yeah, so I actually haven't had the chance to play pre-patch in either Dungeons or Mythic Plus. Sorry, Dungeons or Raid, but I have had the chance to do Dungeons on beta, which is pretty similar to how it will play, as well as all the raid testing and the last one with the most recent changes. So I'll say on the whole, it feels like some parts are better, some parts are worse, but I think that overall it's worse than what we had specifically in Season 4 and Season 3. Maybe we'll get more into specifics, but right now I'm not feeling too great about the state of Shadow.
Yeah, I feel that. It's a hard shift. I think also things have changed so much. I will say I think a lot of people are we're judging the spec pretty quickly. Obviously, it's just pre-patch, but I think there's enough there to where you can start making bigger judgments about it. And the other thing too, a lot of people are saying it's okay to like the spec too. That's also okay. But pre-patch is a super weird environment we have soulbinds and conduits and an extra covenant ability. You have way too much haste in Mythic Plus. So we're gonna try to extrapolate a little bit of how we think it will play in Dragonflight, but yeah, fair points. All right, Sailor, how about you? How's your pre-patch experience been? Not logging on to pre-patch.
I've had a really great time in pre-patch by not playing it. In terms of what I've actually been doing, I have been playing on beta though. I've done beta dungeons, and the experience hasn't been wholly bad, but there's still a lot of glaring issues that we'll probably get to later in this podcast. Basically revolving around things like Shadow Crash and just slight numerics, and of course balance. But we'll get to that later, I'm sure.
Yeah. Yeah, balance is definitely something that you can tell that they're kind of waiting to do balancing, because pre-patch is obviously kind of a meme in terms of balancing, with people having access to things or bugged interactions that won't be there in Dragonflight. So hopefully we don't see any knee-jerk reactions from a whole lot of things, but yeah, it definitely feels like they haven't done a whole lot of spec balancing yet, but we'll see. And then Jereico. So Jereico, as some of you might know, is also playing quite a lot of Evoker on beta, but unfortunately, he can't be an Evoker main yet on live. So for now, we have him as a Shadow Priest. So how's your pre-patch been?
You got it. That's right. And of course, the guild, the guild's coming together, being like, "What are we gonna do? Are we gonna raid Mythic this week? Or are you just gonna take it easy? It's pre-patch. It's a meme." we went in and did some heroic Nathria, so I at least got a full set of bosses under my belt on the pre-patch with my mostly season 3 geared character, I'll admit. But I did have a chance to sort of play a full set of bosses with I did some with a sort of Dark Ascension oriented build. I did a little bit of Voidform. All in all, I have to say, I think my experience was pretty similar to how I felt about it when I was, previously testing on the dummies. It's a bit of an adventure. Just to sum it up real quick, it's a bit of a learning curve from where we left off in Shadowlands. Not necessarily for the better. Not necessarily that the gameplay loop is super different in Raid, and frankly, I think it is something that you could get used to if you were sufficiently motivated to main Shadow on live. But I think as we'll go through, I'm still a little bit skeptical about the value of having, say, Mind Flay and Mind Spike in the same rotation, and why I want DA or Void Form, those sorts of things. I'm still not necessarily really feeling. So, not too much M plus yet, but those are sort of my first impressions from rating at the very least. So
Sweet. Yeah, I think like to really sum up what you're saying, I think to put it another way, the spec just doesn't feel intuitive right now.
that's exactly right, for sure.
I think there was a certain finesse applied to Shadow, maybe in previous tiers. Obviously, that's been kind of changed over the last couple of expansions, but to a certain degree, the spec kind of played itself in a way of speaking, saying that like, oh yeah, if you popped open your Shadow Priest and you gave it to someone, they could probably figure out the right way to do it pretty quickly, right? And now that is definitely less true. I think like Mind Spike, you said, definitely contributes to that problem. Mind Flay Insanity to a certain extent. And then obviously our cooldown's not really making a whole lot of sense of like why you pick Void Eruption versus Dark Ascension. Which I think are all things we want to go over. But yeah, I think there's and maybe this is just kind of growing pains with the talent tree as well, because obviously, I don't know if Shadow is in like the same boat as everyone else or not, or if we're just kind of uniquely like the tree is just a little bit of like unfinished, maybe a little messy, and then unintuitive. Like that, some of those themes might just be the talent trees needing extra work. I don't know if anyone has thoughts on that.
And I guess one quick thing I'll tack on is obviously I've also been playing Shadow since Legion, so I was fresh in Legion and have kind of been suffering the migration every expansion since, every rework. This is, thinking about Legion to BFA, BFA to Shadowlands, and now Shadowlands to Dragonflight. This might be the most, somehow, right, the most jarring that disconnect has sort of felt between these two expansions. And it's strange to me because obviously BFA to Shadowlands was a change from, here's this Voidform ramping style to an actual builder spender.
Yeah.
But you were still kind of building the same way. And it was just, hey, I just put in my spender now instead of always building, right? But here I have a lot more to juggle, and it's just, it definitely, it's been a lot for sure. So
It was a natural evolution from expansion to expansion, even though it might not be the evolution we all wanted.
Yeah.
The change from Drain to Spend with Devouring Plague, it doesn't feel like this is really an evolution from Shadowlands to Dragonflight.
It's an amalgamation. It's just like they brought a bunch of stuff back, and I don't think they were quite like where does it all fit, And I think and I will continue to use their words against them as long as it fits my narrative, but they talked about like, we want you to be able to build your own Shadow Priest, and I think part of that was like why they brought back Mind Spike and Dark Ascension. But I think the problem with some of these spells is they just kind of comes down to tuning, which is, I think, one of the things that is still on the table. So a lot of people keep asking like, oh yeah, well if they just change this or rework the design of this talent, everything will feel better. Which I would love it if we got more design time. But I'd say it's probably like 99% chance or very unlikely that we're not going to see any like design changes to the spec or talents. But I do think tuning is still on the table to be done. And I think to a certain extent, they could tune the spec to make it fun and playable in both Mythic Plus and Raids, at least to a certain extent. So let's talk about tuning a little bit. I'll go to Saeldur first. I think just in general, like, what are some things that you want to think about or like really want Blizzard to look at it when it comes to tuning? I think we talked about things like Idle N'Zoth. I think just general insanity feel. I mean, what comes to your mind?
The biggest complaint I have is the Idol of N'Zoth itself, because of the way they've lowered the power level of it. The nerf to the square root scaling that they did, I think, is actually a good change that stopped it from just being too strong on too many targets. But just capping it to 4 has introduced so many other problems with it detonating in time, even with the bad luck protection they added where it goes off on kill. It's just there's a chance that it just doesn't kill that monster until the pack ends or it doesn't go off, and it's just that significantly lowers the damage and the fun of using it. Not only that, but it now doesn't really do much damage because they nerfed it 3 times at once. And then Insanity is a problem that most people that have probably played keys or anything have noticed, that because on AoE you can't use things like Mindflare Insanity or Void Torrent, your Insanity generation is lacking. And it's very noticeable that you can't use your spender, and because you can't use your spender, you don't feel like you can keep up with other DPS. And that's partly down to the fact that they nerfed Auspicious Spirits in the recent update, as well as Maddening Touch, lowering their Insanity generation by a significant amount.
And I think like the change is that there's no like consistent Insanity gen on AoE unless you're like just spamming Vampiric Touch, basically, right?
Yeah. It's also it also now makes us even more reliant on using things like a Mindbender to get Insanity to actually do any damage. That it doesn't particularly feel fun because we're already reliant on Shadow Crash to put dots out to do anything. But now we need Shadow Crash and our Mindbender, and then it's just great. So getting more consistent access to Insanity would be a significant gameplay feel increase, I think.
Yeah, and I think the Maddening Touch nerf was the one that felt the strangest to me. So for those of you that didn't know, Maddening Touch used to be, it was always a 2-pointer talent, but at rank 2, it just gave Vampiric Touch a 100% chance, like every tick of VT to give a 100% chance to get Insanity. And now it got nerfed down to 60%. So we have like an RNG low amount of Insanity on Vampiric Touch ticks. Yeah, and like granted, this was like, I think a good chunk of your Insanity generation in AoE, but I think to your point, it made the spec flow, I think, better, and you had less moments where, like, I think it's okay in AoE, like, if tuning made sense to, like, press Mind Flay, press Mind Blast as, like, filler spells in AoE, like, that's fine to an extent, but I think the frequency of your Insanity generation is so volatile, it feels like that, you know, it's not that fun for me, at least.
I certainly agree with that. Does anyone else have any opinions on this, like Shop or Jereico?
I just think the nerf to Maddening Touch was completely unwarranted.
Yeah.
I definitely because obviously I ran some keys with Sail on the beta just to kind of get a sense really even just because I'm familiar with how some of these polls work on the beta just to kind of see in the hands of someone who clearly knows what's going on and has a good idea of sort of the optimal rotation. Watching Sail sort of, he's kind of able to pop off when he has his resources, when he has his Mindbender up, when he's getting his sort of Mind Devour procs, right? Like, absolutely able to just, keep up and go ham. But I'm not really understanding, I suppose, what the value of kind of killing that Insanity engine is on those, like, say 30-second timer pulls. The pack-to-pack, for example, I don't know why you have to feel so starved for Insanity necessarily, and that's sort of a bit of a question mark for me for sure. It seems like when you have your stuff, you're okay, but when you don't, it feels kind of feast or famine. At least that's the sense I get. So
yeah, and obviously, like, this will change pretty heavily whether you're talking about pre-patch keys or Dragonflight keys. I think right now things probably feel better than they should. I mean, because you're inside of dungeons, you're likely getting the haste buff from the Dreadlord affix, from the Season 4 affix, and getting more haste is naturally always going to make, like, it's going to patch holes in the rotation. I think Shot was talking earlier that, like, yeah, Season 4 even made Searing Nightmare kind of fun, But, like, obviously, it's going to feel quite different at level 70, when we're going to have, like, maybe 10-15% haste in pre-raid gear, something like that.
Most notably, that first season affix is purely, it's just a damage amp. It's not, it's certainly not giving you secondaries or anything like that to sort of bolster that feeling.
Yeah.
So that will be a change.
Yeah, so I think pre-patch keys are kind of, I don't know, I don't want to say that they're bad, but I think it's maybe giving people false images of how the spec will play, because getting access to, like, that much raw haste is not going to happen again, probably, unless maybe they do another, like, Season 4-esque affix, but the power level of just that, like, from a gameplay perspective, it's going to feel way different, I think, and like, it just feels like you're struggling to get out your Mind Sears when you want it, at least on beta keys. I don't know if anyone else has had a similar experience with that on beta. Like, Shot, have you done, like, does that make sense? Am I crazy?
Yeah, I've definitely done a few keys, and the insanity is an issue. It's very feast or famine with Mind of our procs at this time.
Oh yeah, that's a great, yeah. I mean, and I don't know if this is necessarily a topic about tuning, but yeah, it really feels like our AoE is just kind of how lucky did you get with Mind Devour, and specifically the talent version of Mind Devour, which if you get a Mind Devourer proc, your next Mind Sear costs no insanity or Devouring Plague costs no insanity. So it's effectively you get 100 insanity for free if you cast a Mind Sear, which is double the value of Devouring Plague effectively in terms of insanity per cast or whatever. So yeah, and if you get super lucky and you just go Mind Blast, Mind Sear, Mind Blast, Mind Sear, Mind Blast, Mind Sear, it feels great, I'm sure. But without that, not so much. And then Saeldur, the other point that you touched on was N'Zoth. So can you talk to me a little bit about what's missing with N'Zoth right now? Because they did that was one of the things we recently got changed or semi recently. So N'Zoth stacks now detonate on death, which is good. Like, that's a positive. But in doing so, I think they adjusted the proc rate, and then they changed how it had, like, the AoE scaling of it, right?
Yeah. So they did three changes. They lowered the damage by 60 something percent, I think. Yeah. They increased the proc rate by 50%, and they gave it square root scaling so that it doesn't do full damage to every single target. And they cap the number of targets it can actually hit to 4. Or not the number it hit. The number of debuffs you can have out at once is 4.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah. Which is annoying in some scenarios, because if you have stacks on the wrong mobs in, like, raiding environments, for example, they might just not be useful. If you have stacks on the wrong mobs in Mythic Plus, they may be in the wrong place. They may die last. They may just not get full value. Before, you used to be able to effectively average out the luck on this by having it work on every single mob in the pack because of the number of events. But now that doesn't work, and it won't average out even with the procs on death. It's just the number of stacks you're going to get is just so limited.
Yeah, I'm just thinking about a fight where the boss gets like a 99% aura reduction. Like, it stops. Like, it's not immune, but it takes reduced damage. Where, like, whenever that happens, Shadow was always like, oh yeah, you can still leave your dots on the target to get passive insanity from, like, in this case, Maddening Touch or Auspicious Spirits. But now, doing that, if you're running N'Zoth on that fight because that intermission has a lot of AoE or whatever, well, that target is most likely going to have one of your 4 N'Zoth debuffs, which is going to be pretty feels bad. So yeah, it feels like they 1 step forward, 3 steps back kind of a thing.
Yeah.
And maybe you can talk about this or if someone else has input, but I think one of the sad parts about Shadow Priest AoE, which I think, again, is somewhat of a tuning thing, is like we have all these little things that kind of do AoE, but none of them feel like they're defining to the spec, if that makes sense. Like, for all the problems that Searing Nightmare had, it made it very obvious what you do in AoE. It's like, oh yeah, you press Searing Nightmare. Like, that's what you do. But I feel like even though we have all of these tools, like we have Psychic Link, we have Inescapable Torment, or the new version of Shadowflame Prism, we have Idol N'Zoth, we have Idol of Yogg-Saron, but none of these feel like defining enough to really, like, oh, this is Shadow's AoE. Like, this is what you do in AoE. And like Psychic Link, I think, is the worst loser out of all of them right now. Yeah, which is like I would love to see them kind of be like, yeah, you know what, Psychic Link is the reason we're gonna buff its damage and make it work against all of your single target spells or whatever, or something. But I feel like, N'Zoth could have been that. Then they nerfed it. Yogg could have been that. Then they changed it quite heavily. So. Yeah, how do you guys feel about that? I guess we'll go with Jereico. Is there like a play style that you were particularly attracted to with all the rework and everything?
Oh boy, okay. So thinking about sort of, I guess Shadowlands AoE, I was definitely going into Shadowlands, right? I was very excited that it's like, all right, we now have a mechanism for dealing that sort of burst AoE, and we have mechanisms for sort of applying dots to enemies, right? So the biggest thing coming out of BFA obviously was, I've got to run into a pack. I've got to start VTing everything. I got to, by the time everything's actually grouped up and going, the pack's half dead. So unless I'm a super pro gamer Shadow Priest who's like always, ahead of the tank and on top of stuff, I'm always falling behind, right? So Shadowlands gave an opportunity to sort of, build up that burst profile with Searing Nightmare a little bit. we had some opportunities early in the expansion to explore sort of Surrender to Madness and, bolster our insanity generation that way to kind of keep things going before SFP was a thing. And then SFP sort of gave us this opportunity to start considering this gameplay where you're playing single target buttons in an AoE situation, which sort of lent this direction to let's call it this kind of Blade Flurry style of push single target buttons to do AoE
A ranged
damage,
outlaw
this
rogue.
cleave. Absolutely, right?
Yeah.
That's the sense I got when they introduced SFP. I was like, all right, bam, there's my my flurry button, and I have it once every minute. I can't always use this, but I have it, right? So my understanding now is obviously that SFP is still there. It's still strong. Once every minute, you still have an opportunity to sort of press your single target buttons and go ham on groups of 4 to 5 targets. But it is target capped at that level, obviously. You absolutely have this opportunity to just go ham with a full channel Mind Sear when you proc a Mind Devour proc, and that still seems to be, roughly iconic and part of that. And those two elements are carryover from Shadowlands, as best I can see it. It's kind of that periphery of other stuff that you're doing that I'm not necessarily getting the feeling of. That's not necessarily vibing with me, where it's like, all right, I'm not exactly sure what fillers I'd love to be pushing at any given moment. I don't necessarily understand, when N'Zoth is super good, when I want to run like a Yogg or a Cthulhu, God forbid, or something like that. And to me, so I mean, I guess if I were to say what I love, playing the most, to me, the SFP playstyle actually is relatively enjoyable. Assuming that playstyle sort of looks like I roll up to a pack, I throw out my Mind Bender, I start spamming my single target buttons. I've got ghosts going everywhere, and my Shadow Fiend is like cleaving on everything. Right, my Mind Bender's cleaving. That's kind of cool. I can get behind that. But I mean, as you said, there is this sort of trickling effect with Shadow where you have about 3 times as many damage instances as anyone but a like Windwalker Monk, where it's I've got a little bit of damage from this, a little bit of damage from this, a little bit of damage from this, and it all comes back to this just level of, is this intuitive? Do I really understand what is driving my damage? I think right now it's Inescapable Torment and Mind Sear with procs for the most part, but beyond that, I don't know that I'm really getting it. So that's kind of, I think that's how I'm kind of feeling about AoE right now. If that's
yeah, and I think
sums it up.
it's just not clear of like, I think specifically when you start fighting more than like 8 targets, things get really weird. Because you're like, oh yeah, Shadow Flame Prism, target capped. N'Zoth is kind of capped in like different ways, and like all of this other stuff. Like you don't get more Yogg procs in AoE, and it's like what am I doing? Like what should I be doing isn't clear or intuitive. And I think part of that also comes with our cooldowns. So I'll go to Shot next on this. So they gave us a new cooldown. So we have a 1 minute Dark Ascension cooldown as a choice against the 2 minute Void Eruption. But I still think, calling it unfinished is being very nice. Like there's not a whole lot of definition there. So I guess like Shot, from your perspective, like what are some things like either tuning wise or whatever that they can do to make these cooldowns feel better outside of just deleting Dark Ascension?
So because I have a bias of Voidform, I can't really speak to Dark Ascension, but
Sure.
I will say that what I want is, if they're going to coexist, then I feel like they should have 2 distinct playstyles, and right now I don't think Dark Ascension's pure direct damage spells is good enough right now, and its strength is actually derived more from Ancient Madness and something else I'm trying to recall. I want to say it's the power of just Mind Spike itself with the talent in the Priest tree. I don't remember. Sale, do you know what that talent's called again?
Sorry, which talent?
The one for mind games.
Oh, manipulation?
Or... Manipulation, yeah.
Yeah, manipulation. Like that's and mind melt. Like that's the entire strength of Dark Ascension. It's not in the cooldown itself. So I think that, if they're gonna coexist, I would like Dark Ascension to have a more defined playstyle. But when it comes to Voidform itself, what I want is, what I think would be beneficial as a quick fix if they weren't going to make any long-term changes, or like large changes until a new patch, is its damage bonus added back in, so we have a reason to extend, because they added that extend mechanic, but
Can you
we
explain
lost
that
the
real
reason
quick?
to extend. Okay, so Void Form replaces Shadow Form. and Shadowform has a damage bonus of 10%, and before Voidform had a damage bonus at 20%, which means it was actually replacing the 10% damage bonus, which is like 9.09% damage, but you can just think of it as 10% extra damage on Voidform. And then they nerfed Voidform's damage bonus to 10%, which means Voidform actually does have a damage bonus over Shadowform. So the only thing you're benefiting from is the refresh Mind Blast charges, Void Bolt, and Mastery, which on single target, it's basically only Void Bolt and the refresh Mind Blast. And I don't think that's compelling enough to have the extend mechanic. So that's one thing I would add. And then the other thing is Ancient Madness is just way too strong right now for Dark Ascension, because it benefits from it twice over Void Form. It lasts the same duration, and it has the same effectiveness, but Void Form is actually bugged right now.
It's super bugged.
Where Ancient Madness decays at a rate of 2% per second, which is probably carrying over from the old Ancient Madness. So what I would suggest is either have the effectiveness in a non-bug state, have the effectiveness of Ancient Madness for Dark Ascension, or double the decay rate, or like reduce the duration, so that basically they benefit from the talent equally. And then that way you'd have, Dark Ascension wouldn't have just a reason that it's better than Void Form just because of its design.
Yeah, and just if that wasn't clear for people, so one of the many bugs that we have in the spec is with Ancient Madness. So Ancient Madness is effectively half as good for Void Form than it is for Dark Ascension for many reasons. Actually, worse than that. So for Ancient Madness with Void Form, it only lasts 10 seconds right now. It doesn't last 20 seconds. And in that 10 seconds, you reduce your crit, obviously, much faster. So it's just way worse for Void Eruption. Kind of feels like they messed up and they meant to do the opposite thing. But yeah, and obviously none of that is reflected in the tooltip for the talent either, which makes it extra fun and extra confusing. So
it's almost like they forgot to double the amount of crit we get on Void Form, but they doubled the drain.
Yeah. So yeah, hopefully that gets looked at. All right, so let's just kind of, I think as far as like tuning goes, we'll probably hit that in some other sections. So just to kind of cap off some other kind of AoE stuff, let's talk about just Shadow Priest AoE in general, and I think let's just kind of start with Sear. We talked about it a little bit, but and Saeldur, we'll kind of start with you. I think how do you feel about just the change with Sear in general, and like how Sear is playing, and just in general the design concerns of that as a spender now?
I think the general change to Mindset as a spender is good. Before, when you had Mindset as a generator, it basically invalidated the rest of our spec, and everything boiled down to press Mindset. There's lots of targets. There's no point pressing anything else. They don't make anywhere nearly as much insanity. Just press Mindset. So I think in that sense, it makes sense. However, there's a lot of annoyances with using it currently as a spender because it is a channel spell. It's not instant. In some cases, having it cast would actually feel better because it would spell queue, stuff like that, and it wouldn't have issues with Mind Devourer being weird with the value. Because Mind Devourer is twice as valuable with a Mindset proc than the Iron Plague right now, for example. But as a whole, I think the overall change is positive, and using it as a spender isn't an overall negative experience. There are just other spec issues with the spec currently.
Yeah, and I think... Yeah, go ahead, Jereico.
Okay, I just obviously had a quick brain blast moment. Is there a good reason why Sear is still like a 2 global channel in this paradigm, or like could it just be a 1 global channel and still be kind of okay?
Actually,
I'm kind of trying to understand
really
right now why
like
it's still 2.
The idea of spending our entire bar.
I mean, that is true for sure.
I don't actually think there's anything wrong with Sear specifically. I think the issue is with the rest of the kit.
Yeah, I think, but like just from like a feel perspective, I guess the question is, what's the difference of it having a channel to dump your insanity versus a cast that just dumps all of your insanity? Does that make sense? Like, just have a cast that scales and just consumes all of your insanity and has a cool animation, obviously. But I think like that's yeah.
The difference with a cast and a channel is that a channel you can like divide it into ticks. A cast it would be each time. So I don't know if you were talking about a 2 global channel or like versus a 1 global channel. Is that what you were alluding to? Jer?
Yeah. So for me, I was just quite literally thinking, okay, well, you solve the Mind Devour problem by just having a one global channel on Mindseer, and you can chain it and just pandemic it as you would, and it would play effectively the same that way, more or less. Except obviously to be able to spend like 75 at a time, right? That's the only real difference there. But
Be awkward.
but yeah, I'm not like trying to die on that hill or anything. I just thought it'd be like an interesting thing to bring up. Is just that piece, because obviously there are interactions here with Mindseer being a channel. Obviously it's periodic, it's sustained. You get one tick at a time, which is sort of it's hitting twice as often, and also of course there are the interactions with like mental decay and screams and that sort of thing. So there's interactions there. But yeah, just the periodicity that you're actually playing, that you're holding it for the two globals fully, and then this interaction, of course, with Mind Devourer is kind of having me curious, why the spender has to be this sort of long channel necessarily. Devastation, obviously, what I've been playing a bunch is is also Spec.
Oops, did I lose you?
Hello?
Rest in peace, Jereico. Jereico started talking about Evoker and then he DC'd.
Oh, weird. How'd that happen?
Dang.
All right, yeah. No, I'll wrap up that point real quick though. But obviously, Devastation is just doing that two global channel spend all day long, right? With disintegrates, so it's not like that's an inherently ridiculous idea. I'm just kind of ideating if it makes the most sense in the.
Yeah, no, I get what you mean.
It just reduces your actions per minute, right? If it was 50 insanity over a global, then to spend an entire bar, you'd need 2 channels, but you can still cancel halfway and not lose anything.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I do. It is kind of like, I don't know if I particularly enjoy like casting it at 50 insanity. Feels really weird to me. I don't know. Maybe it's just like a muscle memory thing, but I don't know. Just it's really fast. I don't know. Not the most satisfying thing in the world, but.
I really hooked onto sales thing though about being able to queue it. Do you guys kind of feel upset when you can't like nicely queue channeled spells? Is that a thing that bothers you guys?
I don't really care, honestly. I mean, maybe I care more in AoE, but I didn't never really mind it for Mindfully at least.
What do you mean by queue channel spells?
So I guess you end your channel and then start up basically going from casting a channeled spell into a direct damage spell without losing damage kind of thing.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, you get used to it, I think. I mean, if you play it long enough.
Yeah. Mindseer is less of an offender on that one, especially just because it ticks in a very sane way. But of course, the Evoker one ticking on 0, 1, 2, 3 means you have to be like extremely careful to not lose that last tick. It's a bit of a nightmare. So anyway.
Yeah. It's normally fine because you can just queue up stuff on the global because it's globally aligned. But with Mindset, as it currently stands, you kind of want to channel an entire thing because of the buff and the tier set.
Oh yeah,
that's another point as
right.
well. With like Mind Devourer and the tier set both make you kind of like want to sit for a full channel of Mindset rather than the short one. That kind of eats into that part.
It is a little bit awkward, like waiting until you're out of insanity to queue up your next spell.
Yeah.
But I think it's probably something we'll get used to.
Yeah. I think overall, like, I think we all pretty much agree. Like, from a feel perspective, it's hard not to be better than Searing Nightmare, which I think this feels better. But I think to your point earlier, Shot, like, there's the other things around Mindseer that I think are more of a problem. So anything else on Mindseer before we hit on those? Going once, twice. Okay, so I'm just going down the list that we've talked about ahead of time. So yeah. I think Saeldur, do you want to hit this first one? Is this you that wrote this?
Which part? The Warlock part.
The agony part. Yeah. Now we're talking about Affliction Warlocks for a half second.
Here we go.
Okay, so I thought it would be interesting to have a direct comparison to Affliction because it's the close class to how it plays to Shadow.
Yep.
And so first things I wanted to point out was basically Warlock does not need cooldowns to do damage. As long as it has Agony out, its resource generation is basically guaranteed by having Agony out, and then you can just press Seed. You don't need dubs, you don't need anything. Having your cooldowns on Affliction just increases your damage further beyond that, and isn't required to do any damage. You can get enough damage just by casting like 3 or 4 Agonies. That is down to the fact that Agony has non-linear scaling. The more Agonies you have out, the less valuable they are. Whereas for us, we have linear scaling with our dots. We need them all to have any value, basically. Then you've got other parts of the aspects of, like, that make it feel bad. Like, they have Seed that applies like corruption. We don't have anything that applies pain conveniently other than Shadow Crash. Valtane is basically Shadow Crash, but it's not a stupid projectile spell, and they don't actually need it for damage. We do need ours. And they also have things like Soul Flame, which is basically Idol of N'Zoth, but just better.
Just better. Yeah.
And it's also a tier 2 talent instead of a capstone.
Yep.
Yeah. And I think can you speak a little bit more about the agony point? Because I think this is a good thing to bring up. So we don't have Dark Thoughts anymore going into Dragonflight. You know, we that's now been removed. And to quote replace that, we now have Shadowy Insight, which is your Shadow Word Pain ticks give you a chance to reset the cooldown on Mind Blast. And you brought that comparison up a little bit. Can you talk a bit more about that?
Yeah, so if anyone was playing maybe it was a month or two back, we had a short period of time when we had a bug that Shadowy Insight was a flat chance to proc, and we would get more Mind Blasts on AoE. This helped solve the resource issue that we previously mentioned on this podcast already today, and made the AoE rotation flow considerably better. However, that may have been too many Mind Blasts, as you basically just always could press Mind Blast.
Sure.
And that's where it leads back to how Agony works. Agony does not scale linearly with targets. The more you have, the less they give you. And if they apply something similar to Shadowy Insight, so that, like, say, having 4 dots out would do double your proc chance, 9 would be triple your proc chance, you would have better AoE generation. You'd scale up with targets for things like for apparition generation, for stuff like Yoxeron. You'd also just generally scale up better, while also not scaling completely out of control.
Yeah, which is something I think, and still it would help in the sense that I think it is unique to Shadow, or, you know, it is something like pressing our Shadow spells in AoE is fun. Like, that's, you know, we want to do that. We want to press them, but like they need to happen frequently enough so that the interactions with those spells feel rewarding. And that's kind of what you're getting at, right? Like, if we can weave in more Mind Blast, that does open up the door for anything that works off of Mind Blast, which there's quite a lot in our tree, right?
And I know last podcast, we were focusing on a lot, you know, very sort of small, quick adjustments that can be made to a lot of these things. I think we're kind of moving into, you know, release territory here. So I think it's fair to start to open up and go, you know, okay, well, what would actually fix things? I think the Mind Blast proc situation is absolutely one that we should, like, push for and consider, because it makes a ton of sense, especially, you know, if you sort of have it scale up in a fair way like that. Like, there's no doubt in my mind that makes a ton of sense. So,
and I think it's also, like, you know, it's really important to talk about this from, like, a tuning lens, because with the amount of Mind Blasts we're getting now, talents like Psychic Link or whatever that really rely on some of these casts feel really undertuned. So they could kind
also
of
nerf Mind Blast, right? They nerfed it quite heavily.
Yeah.
The cooldown was nerfed, right?
No,
damage.
they nerfed the base damage on it, and they
the
nerfed
damage
all of
is-
the talents that buffed its damage.
Oh, okay.
They took off like 30 or 40% of its
When-
damage, and
when
then they
did they do
nerfed all the talents. That was
When
like
was
2
that?
months ago.
Okay.
okay, yeah.
It's been a while. But yeah, and they nerfed Psychic Link. It's just like, I don't know. It just feels off. Like, it feels like there were too many things happening at once, or too many cooks in the kitchen maybe, and there's just like, yeah, like, why is Psychic Link? It's 30% now, right? And it was 60% as a talent in Shadowlands?
Yeah, 60.
Yeah. So, I don't know. It feels like they were trying to, like, actively fix, like, the damage breakdown of the spec in single target, and that's, like, why they've been nerfing Insanity. That's probably why they nerfed Mind Blast, because they were like, oh no, Devouring Plague should be your top damaging ability in single target. Which for, like, towards the end of Shadowlands kind of was getting close to not happening anymore. And it's like, oh yeah, you shouldn't have 100% uptime on Devouring Plague. But yeah, it feels like these all have, like, negative or knock-on effects to other things. Is kind of what it sounds like. Yeah. All right, so anything else on, you know, just in general, like, Shadow Priest AoE? Anything people want to bring up? I think we hit that pretty well. Yeah, but I think in general needs more work. I think it needs polishing, and I think it really just needs we need something to, like, revolve our AoE around. Maybe that is Mind Sear, but I think Insanity Generation or else, but could be changed. But yeah, go ahead.
So one thing I was thinking about the other day is, like, I feel like our spirits should, now that Sear proc spirits,
Yep.
I feel like our spirits should be a much larger part of our damage breakdown than they are. And they're actually quite a heavy part of our damage breakdown right now on live, but that's because of Haunting Apparitions.
The conduit, yeah.
We're losing Haunting Apparitions, and I'm pretty sure that they didn't touch the spirit coefficient at all going into Dragonflight, which means that they just are going to do all
What is it, 80%?
It's a significantly less more damage than they are right now, and they were all of Shadowlands, which is a problem because in BFA we had Spiteful, right?
Yeah.
And Spiteful was proccing our spirits. So this is the first expansion in a while where we don't have borrowed power increasing our spirit damage by, 50 to, I don't know how much Spiteful was, probably like 300%.
I was gonna say even BFA to Shadowlands was a big hit, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, it definitely was. But we were somewhat compensated by Haunting Apparitions, and that's just lost. And it's really frustrating to me because in Legion, we had Auspicious Spirits talent increasing damage of apparitions by 100%, and that talent was gutted in BFA, and it still remains the exact same damage increase, even though our spirits are no longer that as offending of our damage breakdown in BFA because we don't have Spiteful.
Yeah, and I think everyone shadow apparitions are like universally loved by people. Like they look really cool when people can see them. And like having AoE not revolve around it necessarily, like maybe it could, like that could make sense, but it entices your gameplay to do the right thing in terms of like, yep, spread your dots, use your single targets, like use your shadow spells to generate AoE damage. And we talked about this last time, but I was really surprised that we didn't get, like, we have like what, 3 talents that interact with apparitions, more or less, that you can pick at once. I don't know, it's kind of sad. No exploding apparitions, even sadder. But yeah,
I guess on apparitions real quick. I have been seeing the odd little conversation about even tormented spirits maybe technically making sense now in pre-patch, but I'm guessing that's mostly just because of haunting, right? I get the sense. I don't know if you guys have any further insight on that one, but
I think it's a bit of haunting and the fact that we just have so much haste right now that you don't like the insanity problem is so feast or famine that I think when you have enough haste, like it actually doesn't really matter. But yeah, I don't know. I do think it makes sense, and I think Saeldur, you were talking about this about like ripping out tormented spirits from the choice node.
Yeah, if you had access to both of those, it would also address the AoE scaling problem because Tormented actually does generate a lot of spirits. Not so much on a single target, but it generates more and more the more targets you have, which would help solve AoE, as well as providing like significantly improved gameplay feel because everybody loves seeing spirits.
Yeah, and can you explain why Tormented Spirits is less desirable, at least from like a Dragonflight keys or AoE perspective? Like as a choice node, sorry.
Currently, as a choice node, it's just not desired because Auspicious ends up just putting in so much work for your general insanity generation. And spirits do some damage, so the fact that it increases the damage is nice too. But it's mostly just the insanity generation, and not having that like lowers you to dangerous levels of generation.
Yeah.
And makes you just so reliant on cooldowns. It's possibly good in some dungeons. For example, in pre-patch right now, it might be good in stuff like Gambit because you just pull so many monsters that you take Tormented and you're just gonna spew spirits everywhere. And you're not gonna need the insanity either. But it's because Maddening can carry you on that many targets. I should specify. But
Sure.
But outside of that, it doesn't do much. If you fight like 4 targets, it's just completely outvalued by AS. And even though AS is in its gutted state, like Shot mentioned, like it would be nice to see the damage increase return to it, for example, back up to its old like 100 or even the nerf 50% it had for a while. Just because spirits are just weak, and they have been weak for a while because of borrowed power. They could easily have some of that damage returned. It wouldn't
And
be
I
bad
think
or
probably
anything,
baseline, right? Not like we're not saying to
baseline
buff
preferably.
we're not saying to buff Auspicious Spirits, but like just the base damage of a Spiteful Apparition is too low, basically.
Yeah.
And then the choice node could be: do you want your spirits to generate AoE, or do you want more of them? But I think like that choice becomes really muddy with the current tuning. Is basically what we're saying, right?
Yes.
So, okay.
They could, of course, tune Tormented to be slightly better. That's a further thing. Like
Oh,
they
for
could increase
sure.
the numbers
Yeah.
on it, but or they could alternatively just change how it works instead of because it currently works by it spawns a set. They could change it so it spawns a single apparition, but the problem with that is how Yogg works now. That makes that not really a viable choice.
Ugh,
Sadly,
yeah.
yeah, because if they just made it BFA spirits, like you could basically pick between a specialist or BFA spirits.
Mm-hmm.
That would have worked, but now that Yogg exists, everything works in sets of apparitions rather than singular.
Yeah.
Which is a shame.
Yeah. Okay, so let's kind of move on. We have in the next kind of bigger section. So let's just talk about like the changes that we'd like to see. Obviously, I think like we mentioned before, a lot of the stuff maybe we don't have time to change before launch, but I think it's still important to not lose sight of this. And I think the hopium part of this is that Blizzard with these new talent trees has a new design philosophy that they don't just make changes between expansions. Like, hopefully this means they're willing to tune things or change things up mid-expansion. So I'll go to Shot first on this. So talking a little bit about what things they could change with the current design that we have that isn't like full rework territory. What are some things that you want to see maybe in 10.05 or 10.1 down the road to improve Shadow?
Well, I think for me, the one thing I want most, even though as much as I love Voidform, what would be healthy for the spec is fix the idols, make them more thematic in terms of both gameplay and fantasy, and also what I want for the idols is I want them to have like distinct scenarios where you take it and it's powerful. Like what I want for Yogg is, hey, there's spread cleave targets on this fight, or there's low target count, but I'm still going to be spawning a lot of apparitions. So I'm going to take Yogg and that's going to like increase my damage by a lot. Or Idol and Azoth. There's a lot of targets on this fight or in this dungeon, and they're long lasting, so I'm going to get a lot of stacks, and Echoing Void is going to do a lot of damage. Or even Idol Yasiraj, where it doesn't really do anything for us. What I'd like for there to be more like emotional states in PvE scenarios. Like I know it's a really good PvP talent, but for PvE, I think that an emotional state that should exist is like Execute, where Shadow now has an Execute idol, and it actually does something in Execute. I don't know what that would be, but
yeah, because right now we only
think
have two that really impact PvE, right? In terms of the Jashar states, we have the 80% you get a damage bonus, or when the target is above 80% you get a damage bonus, and then otherwise you get 5 extra seconds. Like that's it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think like specifically for Idol Yasharaj, I think that there should probably be like a baseline effect, and then it's an additive thing instead of a replacement.
So you always get the 5 seconds or whatever it is, and then something else in addition if you match other states. Yeah. Yeah.
And especially Cthulhu, like we all love Tenebro, right?
For sure.
Which is what we call Call to the Void in Legion, and it's been carried over into Shadowlands with the legendary and this talent. Like we just want to see more tentacles spawn. And I think that either some form of determinism spawn or just increasing the frequency by a lot, but maybe reducing the potency a little bit would go a long way in improving the fun aspect of that talent.
And I think that another problem, this has come up a few times, but I think the proc of Isle of Cthulhu is RPPM, which means more ticks does not give you more casts necessarily. So effectively what it means is your proc rate is smoothed out over the course of time, regardless of how many targets you're fighting or how often you're casting, in this case, Mind Flayer, Mind Sear. I think this is another example of a spell that would benefit from having, like, I think the RPPM effect is fine as a baseline, but I think it would be nice to have something else that could also trigger a proc,
like every 200 insanity or something.
Sure, or maybe like every 10th tick of Mind Flay you guarantee one. It could be, or not 10, whatever, like something. But I think giving a bit more agency to the proc, other than just yep I got lucky or no you didn't, for like a play style defining capstone talent, which I think is what we all wanted these to be. I think something like that would be a much bigger improvement.
Yeah, and I think that's a healthy design, not having the full budget of the talent be in RNG.
Yeah.
Having either full determinism or maybe like, half determinism, half RNG.
Yeah. So for sure, yeah. So idols just in general, like double down on how thematic they are and hopefully playstyle defining to a certain extent would be great to see. And I think you had some other things on here. So like how do you feel about like what they could do with Voidform? I know like you and I specifically are pretty big advocates of like the Voidform gameplay, especially the ones that like made a lot of us start maining the Spec and Legion. So what kind, because I think we all agree like Voidform still feels a little unfinished or just lackluster is the way I describe it. So what kind of things would you like to see added or changed with that?
I want scaling haste with Voidform. I think that
Yep.
Voidform and scaling haste go hand in hand, even though there isn't scaling haste in Shadowlands.
Yeah.
And
think- Go ahead.
so, I was just gonna say I don't know if that works with the extension mechanic. Maybe it does, maybe it doesn't, but I think that Voidform should have scaling haste over extension if it existed. Similar to kind of like how Ravenous Frenzy works, where
Yeah.
its extension mechanic is actually very, very minimal to the spell itself, but its stacks that it generates is where a lot of the power budget comes in.
And I think
Like, I'm pretty
Saeldur
sure
actually tested it, right?
Yeah, what you just asked for, I actually did a sim for. This was before a couple of changes were made that made DA better, but it put Voidform ever so slightly above DA. I think it was 3 or 4%, if I remember right, to give it 1% haste for every 15 sanity spent. Well, it was actually 0.5% every 25, but it was effectively every devouring plague is 1% haste.
Yep.
And it was usually getting, what was it, 20% haste by the end of the Voidform, that kind of number.
Sounds
And-
great.
It's not much, but you'll notice, especially
Yeah.
by the end.
Especially because you're pairing it with Power Infusion, right?
Yeah, you're pairing it with Power Infusion. It was using, I didn't change the APL or anything, it was just pressing Power Infusion as normal at the start, and then it just ramped up haste as it ended. So you start with AM Power Infusion, so you still have an opening burst, which is great. Having the opening burst, I think, is very valuable, especially for AoE. So AM being like that, I think should stay as AM and not be changed into the haste. The
Yeah.
haste should just be part of Voidform.
Yeah.
Part of that talent. That way, as soon as the stacks of AM have dropped off, you're starting to ramp up in haste, and you can keep the damage going,
Mm.
whereas everything else is falling off. And then the other talent DA can just be a minute burst. You just get to do minute burst
Or
windows.
like, and I think they already talked about like DA is clearly the easier cooldown, so I think it's fine if Voidform as the one that is a bit more like it's more involved, right? With like you have an extra button now with Void Bolt to press.
Mhm.
I think it's fine for that to be a couple % ahead of the one that's easier. Like that seems fine.
Easier, and also it's more limited in usage. Anytime you have a cooldown that's like it's rolling for an entire minute kind of thing, like friggin' doing keys with Sail, and we'll kill a pack, and we'll be running to the next pack, and he's still in void form. I'm like, what the hell's going on, right? Like,
Yeah.
absolutely. If you have an engine that rewards extending this cooldown, but it's maybe more useful in these long, it's in these long engagements and in raid, whereas DA is this bursty option, right? I'd like that. I think that's an option.
And it's also bringing back identity to Voidform. Like this was like core to the Spec, with old Surrender to Madness days, which is sadly removed, but I think would do quite a lot, just to bring that back into the fold.
I'm sitting here smiling. I'm just imagining that ramping haste again, going like, yeah. I'm still chasing the surrender high, by the way, like 6 years later.
I think we
Still
all
trying
are
to get there.
to an extent.
It's the surrender high to me. It's just the void form high.
I know.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I've always said this, like there was nothing quite in the game that felt I guess Ravenous Frenzy, like to your point, like had aspects of that for sure, but yeah, I wish that kind of thing was more relevant. And at least, we have a couple of the puzzle pieces being added after they've taken them away, but I think, yeah, adding haste back would be awesome to see. All right, so let's go to Saeldur next. Anything else you want to talk about of like maybe even slightly larger changes you'd like to see in the spec and kind of a mid-scope update or rework?
I don't generally have that many changes I want. I want like just more apparition stuff in general as like a big change.
Yeah,
I
somebody
feel
breaking
like
out tormented spirits or
yeah,
whatever.
I feel like we should have had a line for, like on the capstone, which is just all spirit related.
Like
Um,
down to Yogg
whether
Saron maybe or whatever.
yeah,
Yeah,
whether that's Yoga's the capstone or not, I don't really care.
sure.
I'm not particularly filled by his existence, but he does exist.
Yeah.
So I would have just loved like a series of talents. Maybe it could have been like in the middle of the last thing in the tier 2 section would be auspicious spirits. Then directly below that is a series of 4 points that I just spirit related. So you could have your banelings in here, you could have all sorts of stuff in there.
Sorry, what was that?
And
I
it
don't
would
know if everyone knows what that is.
oh sorry, banelings as in exploding apparitions.
There you go.
When making apparitions do cleave damage. It was one of our ideas for doing AoE before they decided to just give us Mindset.
Yeah.
Banelings are these little rolling balls in StarCraft that explode on contact and deal a ton of damage, and that's kind of that's the fantasy for sure.
Yeah, that'd be hype. I agree.
Warlocks already have exploding pets.
No, don't do
Can't have
this.
that.
Oh no.
We've invoked the first. Another class has this. Can't do it.
Oh no.
Drink.
Oh, jeez. Okay. Anything else, Saeldur, that or is that your big one? It's just more apparition
It's
stuff.
just more spirit stuff, I think, is the big one. I mean, cooldowns itself are a pain. I'd like changes to Shadow Crash, please, because right now, if a pack doesn't exactly last 30 seconds, like, it's really, really, really awkward. Because you'll use Shadow Crash on pull, and then you get to the next pack, and you've either had to use Shadow Crash again on the previous pull because it's lasted too long, and then you don't have Shadow Crash, or you've not had enough time, and you don't have Shadow Crash on pull, so you're doing no damage.
And for
So
those that weren't keeping
yeah.
track, that was because Shadow Crash cooldown used to be hasted, so it was much closer to like 20 seconds with gear, and now it's a fixed 30-second cooldown, which makes that much harder, right?
So,
Yeah.
so one criticism I see a lot about that argument is just, hey, Shadow is supposed to be a dot spec. What's wrong with just spamming VTs at the end of that pull? Like, why not just sit there and go VT, 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 VT? All right, keep going. You have any thoughts on on that argument?
At the end of the pull, it's fine. I think at the end of the pull, when the mobs start dying off, if you wanted to cast like 3 or 4 VTs to keep going for the remaining few seconds, that's fine. But in the other case, where you killed a pack too quickly, which is going to happen in the vast majority of queues the majority of players run, the pack will die too fast. You're not going to have Shadow Crash on the next pull. You're not going to do any damage. Because the pack is going to die in 15 seconds, you do not have time to cast Vampiric Touch. The reward for casting Vampiric Touch isn't high enough, despite it basically being mandatory for our damage.
Yeah.
You'll be better off just pressing buttons. And that is not a good feeling.
And it still feels like part of that is just like people call Shadow a dot class, right? And a dot spec. But in order to call the spec that, our dots need to do more damage.
I think that's true as well.
There's a line between dots are very powerful but hard to spread, or dots are not as powerful but easier to spread.
I think there is an enormous component to the value proposition of sitting there and spamming dots if they're doing damage on their own or if they're just enabling you to do stuff. I think that's a significant part of that conversation.
Yeah, and I'm fine waffling in one area or the other, but Shadow is definitely in especially with Vampiric Touch and Shadowed Pain damage, definitely in an area of like, yeah, they're really not doing that much damage. They're just there to activate other parts of your kit. Or like passive Insanity Generation with Vampiric Touch, right? And I think that's kind of like, you kind of have to sit where you want. So if you want to call Shadow a dot spec, great, let's buff the dots then to make it feel more rewarding of like spending all of that time dotting a pack, because right now it doesn't feel like that, at least to me personally.
I suppose that's the point I can go back to N'Zoth from earlier. N'Zoth used to be a reason to cast Vampiric Touch and just put more VTs up. What's the point now? You can only have 4 N'Zoth.
Yeah.
That basically N'Zoth used to be adding damage to your dots to make them rewarding. Now there's no damage increase to dots on the entire... Okay, Coalescing Shadows and Dark Evangelism technically do. But other than that, there is nothing that increases the damage to your dots on the entire tree. And they just don't do much. Like, at the end of the dungeon, they're going to do like 20 or 30% of your damage, but that's just because you can apply a lot of them with Shadow Crash nowadays, which is basically Shadow Crash being good, and being good for our class.
And
you have that, and you have
like we have all these different play styles, and they've kind of, it seems like they've nerfed them before we got a chance to really use them and play with them. And I really think we need to take a feel, like the spec should feel fun first, and then we'll tune it, you know? And it feels like they haven't quite done that with things like Idol of N'Zoth. Like, I would love it if in dungeons you're like, oh yeah, I want to go whole hog into, you know, Mindseer Screams and Idol of N'Zoth build, and I'm gonna, like, that's where my AoE is gonna be revolved around, right? And I want N'Zoth to be at least 10% of my damage, if not more. Ideally like 15 or 20%, honestly. Or maybe you'll build it differently and be like, oh no, I want an apparition focused AoE playstyle that even relies on things like Psychic Link and Exploding Apparitions or Idol of Yogg Saron, and like that's where my damage is coming from. But the problem is they've pre-tuned it before that became playstyle defining. And I think that's where the lackluster part is. So I'd really like them to, like, N'Zoth should be like, you should have N'Zoth on every target, and they should worry about tuning after that. Honestly, it feels really weird to kneecap it like they did. There's my rant. Okay, Jereico, you're the last one up. Is there anything else that you'd like to see, kind of, to help improve Shadow going in? Maybe even to help you play it more.
Oh yeah, no. So we covered some really good ones, right? I'm still a little bit. Look, I understand Shadow Crash being on 30. I can technically live with it. I preferred it hasted, and I sort of wish there was a middle ground they could find where they can balance it around it being hasted. That's just a better play style to me.
Or 2 charges,
personally.
Maybe? I don't know if you feel about that.
Yeah. Oh yeah, no, absolutely, something like that could work, right? Because in M+, right, there are big differences between sort of playing M+ casually and playing in sort of a prepared group. And a lot of the time in a prepared group, you have opportunities to sort of trade off with other DPS players, where you're going to approach a pack and have your cooldowns for this one. They're going to have it for next one. You're going to have bigger pulls generally, because that's the efficiency play style. And all of this stuff makes more sense in a situation like that. So when you see really good M+ players going, yeah, Shadow works perfectly, I'm able to do tons of damage, it's awesome. A lot of it is coming from that paradigm where you're able to prepare for packs in such a way that you're going to blast. And Shadow can absolutely do that right now. There's no question in my mind. A lot of what happens in sort of more casual keys is a little more scrappier play, where maybe we pull 3 things, and then 10 seconds later we pull 2 more things, and then we pull into a pack of 5, and then that pack of 5 takes 40 seconds to die because someone died or something. Like, a lot of that sort of dynamic playstyle is very hard to manage when you have something like Shadow Crash on 30. Right, so
and you're
that's
like,
a big
do
one.
I just hold the cooldown indefinitely? Because I'm like, what if the tank pulls more in 5 seconds? You know?
Yeah, who knows, right? So that's the perspective that I would come from with a lot of this stuff, is just making things intuitive and accessible to the average person taking on M+. It's a big balancing act to balance for the best players and the roughest players, right? But that's a big one for me.
For sure.
Vic says he was running with a poke tank and had a rough time. So yeah, absolutely.
And that is where, like, the 2 charges of Crash might make more sense than just making the cooldown hasted again, because it does give you, like, agency of, like, oh yeah, use 1 charge on cooldown, and you can kind of save that second for when you need to dot a pack, you know?
I think that would be enough flexibility without just letting you cast it more often, right?
Yeah.
I think that's a fair trade-off for sure. So
Maybe.
I would consider that.
You can also miss it.
Yeah.
Oh god, don't get me started.
I missed one in Jericho's keys tonight.
Yeah, we don't talk about that enough. The fact
Like,
that
it just hits the ceiling and you miss it.
Oh yeah.
Or the tank pulls a boss and, like, pulls it out, like, really fast on pull. Like, I was doing, like, Grim Totem, one of the bosses on beta, and that's a boss that spawns in the middle, but you drag it out, like, immediately. And I did it for a few pulls. Another Shadow in the group did it for a few pulls, where you just lob it on pull because you want to apply your dots, and nope, guy's gone. See ya.
Yep. At least it's less punishing with 1 target, but if you have a massive AoE pack and you actually just miss it, then
it's horrible.
You're hang your head in shame and walk away from your computer, because, like, you're spending the next 10 casts doing VT just to get started again. Like, good riddance.
Yeah.
So.
Okay,
yeah,
so we're going to go a little bit over, but I think this last thing to cover is important. So before we wrap up, I really want to spend some time, and I'm glad that Shot put this. I'll go to him first. Of, you know, let's just talk about how Dragonflight development went for priests. I think a lot of us, including myself, have been pretty, I think, upset is probably the right word, of, like, this is effectively Shadow's 3rd expansion in a row that have gotten significant changes. You know, you could call it a rework if you want, of how the spec plays, that doesn't quite feel finished or done. And I think despite all of that, the community, I feel like, has done a really damn good job of posting feedback. Like, there have been just the forums have exploded with feedback. Now, I'm not saying I agree with all of it, but I think there's just a plethora of feedback to pull from that doesn't feel like it all got addressed. And I'm not saying Blizzard should change everything that we're asking for. Like, that's not what I mean. But I think at least responding to concerns at like a bare minimum, and even that wasn't quite there. So, Shot, let's kind of go to you first. Like, how do you feel about kind of how this beta cycle has gone for Shadow?
Terrible. and
work.
priests in general.
Yeah.
I think my largest frustration is the lack of communication. We have gotten basically zero developer insight, so we have to interpret basically any change that they make. And the one developer communication we did get, powered "Go fuck yourselves," was probably the most negatively received blue post in WoW's history.
Yeah, it's
And
pretty bad.
it demonstrated a clear lack of concern and care for the priest and its community. There were like the entire tone of the article was spiteful. Basically the content was priests can't have this because PvP or other classes have this. Even though this is stuff we either had in the past, like Vault of the Heavens. Apparently Vault of the Heavens isn't part of Priest Fantasy, but Wild Charge on a 15-second cooldown for Druids is. Or they just give it to other classes, like Shining Force. Mages now have effectively Shining Force. Now they can't put it on an ally, it's based on themselves, but it is identical to Shining Force. And I think that it's clear that we don't have a champion for our class. I don't know how to resolve it, but I think that from the general sentiment of the community is this is basically intolerable and we deserve better.
Yeah, for sure. It almost felt like there was like a different set of rules being applied to priests than other specs, right?
Yeah, their philosophy was completely counter to basically every other class.
Yeah. And I think like the biggest thing for me, Sailor, I'll go with you next on this, because I think they spent a lot of, let's just say, their blue post time or dev time in the cycle. Well, I guess I shouldn't say it. They spent a lot of time doing nothing. Like we had one of the very first trees, and it took a lot, like several months before we even got iteration on them. But despite that, the thing that they were focusing the most on was AoE. And it doesn't quite feel finished. Yeah, so Sailor, curious on your thoughts on that or anything else in specific with that.
It's yeah. The first iteration was clearly not done. The one that we got at the very start, it was clearly not done. It was a quick mock-up and we were the first tree. That was fine if they had just decided to iterate on it. The most egregious thing back then was the layout, if I remember correctly, more than the nodes on the tree themselves. There was a lot of questionable choices, like Monomania back then was just awful.
Yep.
And they needed to change that. But it would have been workable. And then we had the, what was it, 2 months before they gave us the feedback post, and then they posted this tree. More or less this tree. It basically just hasn't changed since they've given it to us.
Yeah.
This tree has significantly nicer pathing. It has a lot better layout for the most part. We don't get forced to take as much stuff as we did before. Although we still have to give up utility sometimes if we want all of the buttons at the top, because sometimes you need more, because that's just tuning related.
Yep.
And then you've got just nodes that don't do anything, which is, once again, tuning, but stuff like Harness Shadows are a joke. Maddening has been nerfed into the ground.
Whispers.
Psychic Link is just awful. Whispers is an attempt to give us crit scaling, but we don't need crit scaling because crit's just bad. Like, it's just not a good way of giving us crit scaling, especially with how they've removed everything else that worked with crit from our tree.
Yeah.
And then you've got poor layout at the bottom as well. Like, why is Nizoth over with Insidious Ire and Malediction? Those are single target. Why isn't it not somewhere else? Like, like my biggest complaint right now with this tree is not just the nodes on it, which feel unfinished. Some of the nodes are boring, unattuned, not ideal, and the whole choose your own Shadow Priest just doesn't work. Having Mind Spike and Mindflay Insanity together is a convoluted mess for most people. Good players can make it work by using like my Mind Spike as a proc, so it's just a proc for more damage.
Mm-hmm.
But most people are going to have issues getting used to that.
It's awkward.
And then like you combine that with just the horrifyingly bad layout at the bottom, and it's just, why is this a tree? It's just not done.
Yep. I agree, man.
I think
And then
Ellipsis said this, but like this tree should not have reached the public. It has not left the design stage.
Yeah,
like,
it feels rushed.
I don't know about rushed. I think it's unfocused, uniterated. Like
Yeah.
it looks like it's just at its inception. There's basically zero cohesiveness to it.
Yeah, and we're kind of, I think to your point, I love what you said earlier of like, we have to like guess what a lot of this is. You know, like there's been, and I think a lot of specs and classes are in this boat. So it's not just Shadow, but like, I feel like with some of these new talents, like there should have been some explanation of like, hey guys, here's a new talent for you. Here's what our vision is for that talent. And here's how we think it should work and how you want it, like how it should be used, right? Like, whereas like we really I think needed that for the idle spells or Mindflay Insanity, Dark Ascension playstyle, Mind Sear, because otherwise we're kind of just guessing what their intentions are with things. But it's made it really hard, I think, to give poignant feedback on things because we're just like given a bunch of stuff without anyone explaining how it's supposed to work, right?
And I mean,
but
yeah.
do they even know?
Well, I was about to say, I don't even, I hope this doesn't come across as unfair, but this tree really does feel like they've thrown a whole bunch of things in there and just kind of gone, yeah, we know it's not super intuitive. We know there's not a lot of distinction between these nodes. Figure it out. Just
Yeah.
I don't know. You tell me how it's supposed to play if you're so
First-
smart, right? Like that's that's kind of how I see it.
The first blue post we got when they revealed the tree was they said we added Pain of Death and we added Death Speaker, and we think these two talents are going to interact and make up like a positive improvement to Shadow's AoE. And
Yep.
like,
And gameplay in dungeons, right? That was the big
excuse
focus.
me? Like,
Yeah.
is this a joke? We haven't ever talked about those talents because they're so worthless.
Is that the same time they also made Shadow Crash cool or Shadow where Death cooldown not hasted as well?
I mean,
This close?
this is when they released
So it's talking
the
right off the
preview.
jump.
Okay,
First
got it.
talent tree. First talent
Yeah.
tree. They're like, we know dungeons are an issue. Here's what we're
Here's
thinking
Pain
about
of
doing.
Death. Yeah, that's what we
Yeah.
need. Yeah. Yep. And yeah, it just feels like, yeah, I think to your point, like I guess we don't know as a community, to put it nicely, we don't know what Blizzard's vision is for Shadow. It's unclear. Like we just straight up don't know. And like I don't think any of us are like claiming that we know best and we know how to make the best Shadow Priest in the world, but I feel like we have some pretty damn good ideas, or at least a good place to start. But I think I would love to know, like, Blizzard, how do you expect Shadow Priest to play on a 10 target pack in Mythic Plus? Like what do you see as the future of the spec? Is it kind of the ranged Blade Flurry stuff with things like Psychic Link and Pain of Death? Is it, N'Zoth? Is it Shadow? What do you want us to do? And like the same goes for single target. Like, what's the purpose of having Mind Spike and Mindflay coexist? Or what's the reason to pick Void Eruption over Dark Ascension? And all of these problems are contributing to, I think, like what's making the spec unintuitive. And I think like the hard part about the post you brought up, Shot, cleverly named Powered Go Fuck Yourself, is that as much as I disagreed with a lot of the content in the post, I'm still really happy that we got it, if that makes sense. Like, getting
Imagine if we
communication,
Like-
getting communication is still almost always better than not getting it at all. Like at least we know where they stand with things. But yeah, it feels like, unfortunately, after the backlash from that post and like seeing the Priest forum just explode overnight after that, it seems like they went kind of quiet, which is sad. It sucks. That's not fun. Yeah.
I'd like to tap on another further point based on stuff you've mentioned previously, Pub, but I think that not using the community is just a massive mistake. You mentioned that we're not designers. We may not be able to make the best design Shadow Priest, but if a dev says, I want the class to do this, we can provide feedback on what we think, and
Yeah.
then they can provide what they think about that. And then we can have an actual just proper discussion, like adults, like genuine people that are just interested in the best part of this class and making it the most fun to play possible.
Yeah.
And by doing that, the class will just be better. Even if our ideas are crap. Sadly, he's going to have to wade through all the crap ideas, but at least then they get feedback. At least then they can choose to iterate and design and make things better.
Yeah.
Like we can provide suggestions to concept, we can provide suggestions to everything, but they don't seem to, like, the fact that we just don't know right now is just the most crazy thing to me. The fact that we just don't know what they want.
Yeah, and we're not
about
saying
you?
that like
Yeah.
you need to respond to everything on the forums or whatever. I mean, like, and like we don't even need you to be an expert at Shadow Priest. I don't even need that. I just need you to talk to us. Like, and again, every dev is gonna want to do this differently. Like, some devs maybe only want to post on the forums. Other devs are like sitting in class discords talking to people. Maybe other devs are talking in other channels with theory crafters, but no one's doing that for Shadow. Any of that. Like, no one's really posting on forums about design changes. No one's in our Discord chatting. No one's really messaging any of us on the side. Like, despite what people think, we don't have like a back channel to Blizzard to just talk to devs whenever we want about things. Like, we don't have that, and it just feels like we're missing. Like, it's that connection between the community of us that love Shadow and the devs responsible for building on it. Just don't have that connection right now.
At risk of getting chewed out by these guys, obviously there's such a huge difference night and day between like the Hunter feedback cycle and what Rogues got in terms of their like, just immediate back and forth, community discussions, problem solving, that sort of thing. And where again, we're sitting here just kind of trying to guess intent over and over, and it's wild. And I mean, you guys aren't going to toot your own horn, but if you guys had half an idea of just how many hours Pub and Sale here are spending just on the back end, wading through bugs, trying to figure out what the hell is going on with everything. Like, you guys have no idea, and it's just insane. So I just want to give a bit of a shout out there where it's due. It's crazy. So
yeah, no one look at how Idol of Cthulhu actually works. It's terrifying.
Yeah.
All right.
What do you mean? Do you not like how it works now?
I fucking just make it stop.
Well, I was just going to say that, like, this is definitely a result of us having the persons designing Shadow leave every expansion.
Every
rework.
expansion. Yep.
Like, I'm not blaming the individuals who are designing it now that they don't know. What I think is that if you don't know what you're designing, reach out to the people that do. Or
don't give up, I think, is the other point of, like, anyone that works on software or builds anything for a living, that you can't just build it once and then never look at it again.
Never iterate.
Iteration is important, and I think it's important especially when something needs it right away. Like, and Blizzard's had kind of a nasty habit of not doing that mid-expansion ever since, like, honestly, like Mists of Pandaria, where they're like, yeah, we don't want to change how your spec works unless it's in between an expansion, which I think is just not healthy for the game, honestly.
There was actually a lot of class changes in Legion.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's just like a question of like how and when they do that, and I think over the last couple of expansions they've been doing it a lot through like borrowed power stuff. But since they said we're not getting that in Dragonflight, at least like my expectation is, we should be expecting Blizzard and hold Blizzard accountable to making changes and improvements to the spec over the course of Dragonflight. Like, if Shadow stays the way it is for the entire duration of the expansion, it'll be a massive failure, in my opinion. This is my 2 cents. So, yeah, okay, so we've been talking for quite a while, so I'll give everyone just kind of a chance to do closing thoughts. I'll go to Jereico first. So yeah, Jereico, anything you missed or you want to bring up or shout out before we close it off?
Yeah, so I think earlier you asked me, hey, what would it take for you to get excited about Shadow again, to play Shadow as like, a main and that kind of thing, since I think I'm tilting Devastation at this point, I'll be honest. We obviously, we talked about all sorts of really great ideas on this podcast, but for me, the biggest things are just the unintuitive nature of the rotation. We're talking about mid-expansion things that they could change. I want to see a clear delineation between Mind Flay and Mind Spike. I
Yep.
don't want to see both of those in one build. Personally, I want one or the other. That's me. I want a clear delineation between Dark Ascension and Voidform. I want them to do very different things. The Ramping Haste was a really good idea. I love that idea, but honestly, anything to just separate those main ideas. I could die on the bridge of baseline class utility, and I will continue die on the
Yeah.
bridge. Whatever, it doesn't matter. Die on that hill. Look, I've had this shot down, but I'll say it again. Some sort of baseline movement for this class. Look, I don't
God,
care if it
please.
doesn't fit the class fantasy or whatever, and I don't care if it's overpowered in PvP. Give me a break. Give me something that interacts with Evoker, Blessing of Bronze. It can be a friggin' 2-minute Door of Shadows. I don't care. Just something.
Yep.
And I'll never get this one through, but just baseline kick for God's sake. Something like why are we still having this conversation
Oh, God.
again? Don't care
PvP,
about
dude.
PvP. Find a way to make it work for PvE. It's ridiculous. Having a lot of fun in keys on my evoker, constantly controlling the battlefield, flying over to allies to clear our thundering buff, one thing we didn't really point out is that Shadow actually has some pretty insane passive healing right now, and this is a
Sure.
whole topic, but like Halo's really strong, Vamp Embrace in Dungeons is doing some good work. They're doing really well with that, and Evoker really isn't, but again, like these sort of like that isn't necessarily enough to me for me to feel like the thing is gonna carry and work well in those, again, scrappier, more casual keys. So if we were to, talk about all the feedback we gave today, plus these sort of really specific things that really mean a lot to me personally, I think that's what it would take. So I'll leave it there.
Sweet. I love it. All right, Saeldur, what do you think? What's going to take it for you to renew your sub? And any other closing thoughts you have?
I mean, I'll just resub a Discipline Priest at this point. But
Okay, there you go.
the Shadow itself, it's yeah, I just want the things I basically mentioned all podcast, just better class identity, better just feeling of choice as well on the tree is what I would love. Like at the end of the day, there's always going to be a meta. You're always going to take this build because it's the best.
Sure.
But right now, the build that you take because it's the best is just click all the good notes. There aren't anything else.
Yeah. Yeah, like you always pick Void. Like, yeah, get ready, everyone on live that's like, you think you have too many buttons with Unholy Nova. That bind is just going to get replaced with Void Torrent at level 70, so make sure it's in a good spot.
Oh boy.
Yeah.
Yep. Good luck working that in with your rotation. It's really fun. All right, Shot, what do you have for us?
Well, I'm gonna continue playing Shadow or quit this game, so nothing's going to change that for me. But like, if you want my full opinion, then you can go read my post on the Priest forums, but just Priest deserves better.
Yeah, agreed, man. All right, well, thank you to everyone for tuning in. This is going to be the official kind of end of the podcast, episode 2. If you like this, please let us know, and we'll do more. I'm always down to host more of these if we have things to talk about. So as we get into pre-patch and Dragonflight, we might do more of these. If there's someone else you'd like to see as a guest, more than happy to add other people. Thank you to Shot for joining us and the team for this one. It's been fun. And yeah, again, thanks for watching, everybody.